All right. Welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Before we get into the book today, I just want to let everybody know that I just received David Icke's new book, The Roadmap: Escaping the Maze of Madness. It's in very good condition, and the book itself is kind of broken up into chapters and sections within. It's kind of like a reference book almost, where you can either read the whole book or you can just skip to like different sections, different theories and stuff like that. And he's got a lot of conspiracy stuff in here. And it's actually got a lot of illustrations too. And let me see how many pages it is. It's 540 pages. And then it's got like, let me see, another like 15 pages of bibliography index. So, pretty hardcore. The font is a little small in some parts because it's got like what's it called? Italic. But it's a pretty dense book, even with the photos and stuff in it. It's got like memes in here and stuff. Killing me. It looks pretty good though. I'll have to get to that in a minute. So, all right. Oh yeah, check out Iconic, but it's spelled like ICK. Make sure you. David Icke always has good books. All right, so Tragedy and Hope. Germany from Kaiser to Hitler, 1913 to 1945. I'm on page 426. The PDF is linked in the description below. The period of fulfillment, 1923 to 1930, is associated with the name of Gustav Stresemann, who was in every cabinet until his death in October 1929. A reactionary pan-German and economic imperialist in the period before 1919, Stresemann was always a supporter of the Quartet and the chief creator of the German People's Party, the party of heavy industry. In 1923, while still keeping his previous convictions, he decided that it would be good policy to reverse them publicly and adopt a program of support for the Republic and fulfillment of treaty obligations. He did this because he realized that Germany was too weak to do anything else and that she could get stronger only by obtaining release from the more stringent treaty restrictions by foreign loans from sympathetic British and American financiers and by secret consolidation of the Quartet. All these things could be achieved more easily by a policy of fulfillment than a policy of resistance like Kuno's. The Bavarian government of the Right, which had been installed under Gustav von Kahr in 1921, refused to accept Stresemann's decision to readmit the socialists to the Reich government in Berlin. Instead, Kahr assumed dictatorial powers with the title of State Commissioner of Bavaria. In reply, the Stresemann cabinet invested the executive power of the Reich in the Reichswehr minister as an act which had the effect of making von Seeckt the ruler of Germany. In terror of the rightist coup d'etat, the Communist International decided to allow the German Communist Party to cooperate with the socialist in an anti-right front with the parliamentary regime. This was done at once in the states of Saxony and Thuringia. The Reichswehr commander in Bavaria, General Otto von Lossow, shifted his allegiance from Seeckt to Kahr. Stresemann Seeckt in Berlin faced Kahr Lossow in Munich, with the Red governments of Saxony and Thuringia in between. The Reichswehr chiefly obeyed Berlin, but the Black Reichswehr and underground Free Corps, especially Erhard's and Rossbach's, obeyed Munich. Karl Lassow, with the support of Hitler and Ludendorff, planned to invade Saxony and Thuringia, overthrow the Red government on a pretext of suppressing Bolshevism, and then continue northward to overthrow the central government in Berlin. The Reich government headed this plot off by an illegal act. The Reichswehr forces of Siecht overthrew the constitutional Red governments of Saxony and Thuringia to anticipate Bavaria. As a result, Lossow and Kahr gave up the plan for revolt, while Hitler and Ludendorff refused to do so. By the Beer Hall Putsch of November 8, 1923, Hitler and Ludendorff tried to abduct Kahr and Lossow and force them to continue the revolt. They were overcome in a blast of gunfire. Kahr, Lossow, and Ludendorff were never punished. Hermann Göring fled the country. Hitler and Rudolf Hess were given living quarters in a fortress for a year, profiting by the occasion to write the famous volume Mein Kampf. In order to deal with the economic crisis and the inflation, Stresemann's government was granted dictatorial powers overriding all constitutional guarantees, except that the socialists won a promise not to touch the 8-hour day or the social insurance system. In this way, the inflation was curbed and a new monetary system was established. Incidentally, the 8-hour day was abolished by decree in 1923. A reparations agreement, the Dawes Plan, was made with the Allied governments, and the Ruhr was successfully evacuated. In the course of these events, the Social Democrats abandoned the Stresemann government in protest as its illegal suppression of the Red government of Saxony. But the Stresemann program continued with the support of the parties of the center and right, including, for the first time, the support of the anti-Republican nationalists. Indeed, the nationalists, with 3 or 4 seats in the cabinet in 1926 to 1928, were the dominant force in government. Although they continued to protest in public against the policy of fulfillment, and Stresemann continued to pretend that his administration of that policy exposed him to imminent danger of assassination at the hands of the right extremists. The German cabinets from 1923 to 1930 under Wilhelm Marx, Hans Luther, Marx again, and finally Hermann Müller were chiefly concerned with questions of foreign policy, with reparations, evacuation of occupied areas, disarmament agitation, Locarno, and the League of Nations. On the domestic front, just as significant events were going on, but with much less fanfare. Much of the industrial system, as well as many public buildings, come on, man. Okay, much of the industrial system, as well as many public buildings, was reconstructed by foreign loans. You see what I'm saying? No, it's plural. Much of the industrial system, as well as many public buildings, were reconstructed by foreign loans. The quartet were secretly strengthened and consolidated by reorganization of the tax structure, by utilization of governmental subsidies, and by the training and rearrangement of personnel. Alfred Hugenberg, the most violent and irreconcilable member of the Nationalist Party, built up a propaganda system through his ownership of scores of newspapers and a controlling interest in UFA, the Great Motion Picture Corporation. By such avenues as this, a pervasive propaganda campaign based on existing German prejudices and intolerances was put on to prepare the way for a counter-revolution by the quartet. This campaign sought to show that all Germany's problems and misfortunes were caused by the democratic and laboring groups, by the internationalists, and by the Jews. The center and left shared this nationalist poison sufficiently to abstain from any effort to give the German people the true story of Germany's responsibility for the war and for her own hardships. Thus, the right was able to spread its own story of the war, that Germans had been overcome by a stab in the back from the three internationals: the Gold International of the Jews, the Red International of the Socialists, and the Black International of the of the Catholics. An unholy triple alliance which was symbolized in the gold, red, and black flag of the Weimar Republic. In this fashion, every effort was made, with considerable success, to divert popular animosity at the defeat of 1918 and the Versailles settlement from those who were really responsible to the Democratic and Republican groups. At the same time, German animosity against economic exploitation was directed away from the landlords and industrialists by racist doctrines which blamed all such problems on bad Jewish international bankers and department store owners. Well, there did seem to be some bad international Jewish bankers, as we've seen in chapters previous, like Rockefeller, Rothschilds, that whole thing. So, it wasn't all Jews, but there were some Jews involved. The general nationalism of the German people and their willingness to accept the propaganda of the right succeeded in making Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg President of the Republic in 1925. On the first ballot, none of the 7 candidates received a majority of the total vote, so the issue went to the polls again. On the second ballot, Hindenburg received 14,655,766 votes. Marx of the Center Party received 13,751,615 votes, while the communist Ernst Thälmann received 1,931,151 votes. The victory of Hindenburg was a fatal blow to the Republic. A mediocre military leader and already on the verge of senility, the new president was anti-democrat and anti-republican. To bind his allegiance to the quartet more closely, the landlords and industrialists took advantage of his 18th birthday in 1927 to give him a Junker estate, Neudeck, in East Prussia. To avoid the inheritance tax, the deed to this estate was made out to the president's son, Colonel Oscar von Hindenburg. In this time, this estate came to be known as the smallest concentration camp in Germany, as the president spent his last year there, cut off from the outside world by his senilities and coterie of intriguers. These intriguers, who were able to influence the aged presidential mind in any direction they wished, consisted of Colonel Oscar, General Kurt von Schleicher, Dr. Otto Meissner, who remained head of the presidential office under Ebert, Hindenburg, and Hitler, and Ellard von Oldenburg Januschau, who owned the estate next to Neudeck. This coterie was able to make and unseat cabinets from 1930 to 1934 and controlled the use of the presidential power to rule by decree in that critical period. Kind of sounds like a Biden type of thing. Not laughing at the Holocaust, but it does sound like a Biden type of thing. An auto pen. No sooner did Hindenburg become a landlord in October 1927 than he began to mobilize government assistance for the landlords. This assistance, known as Osthilfe, Eastern Help, was organized by a joint session of the Reich and Prussian governments presided over by Hindenburg on December 21st, 1927. The stated purpose of this assistance was to increase the economic prosperity of the regions east of the Elbe River in order to stop the migration of Germans from that area to Western Germany and their replacement by Polish farm laborers. This assistance soon became a sink of corruption, the money being diverted in one way or another, legally or illegally, to subsidize the bankrupt great estates and the extravagances of the younger landlords. It was the threat of public revelation of the scandal which was the immediate cause of the death of the Weimar Republic by Hindenburg's hand in 1932. The combination of all these events, the real power of the quartet, the short-sighted and unprincipled opportunism of the Social Democrats and the Center Party, the coterie around Hindenburg, and the Oschife scandal, made possible the disintegration of the Weimar Republic in the years 1930 to 1933. The decision of the quartet to attempt to establish a government satisfactory to themselves was made in 1929. The chief causes of the decision were: 1. Realization that industrial plants had been largely rebuilt by foreign loans; 2. The knowledge that these foreign loans were now drying up, and that, without them, neither reparations nor internal debts could be met except at a price which the quartet was unwilling to pay; 3. The knowledge that the policy of fulfillment had accomplished about as much as could be expected from it, the Allied control missions having ended, rearmament having progressed as far as was possible under the Versailles Treaty, the western frontier having been made secure, and the eastern frontier having been open to German penetration. The decision of the quartet did not result from the economic crisis of 1929, but was made earlier in the year. This can be seen in the alliance of Hugenberg and Hitler to force a referendum on the Young Plan. The quartet had accepted the much more severe Dawes Plan in 1924 because they were not then ready to destroy the Weimar regime. The challenge to the Young Plan not only indicated that they were ready, it also became an indication of their strength. This test was a disappointment since they obtained only 5 million votes adverse to the plan from the electorate of 40 million. As a result, for the first time, the Nazis began a drive to build up a mass following. The movement for which they had been kept alive by financial contributions of the quartet had arrived. The effort would never have succeeded, however, were it not for the economic crisis. The intensity of this crisis can be measured by the number of Reichstag seats held by the Nazis. Then it's got a chart showing how basically in April 1924 there was only 7 National Socialists in the Reichstag, and then by March 1933 there were 288 National Socialists in the Reichstag. Okay. The Nazis were financed by the Black Reichswehr from 1919 to 1923. Then this support ceased because of army disgust at the fiasco of the Munich Putsch. This lack of enthusiasm for the Nazis by the army continued for years. It was inspired by social snobbery and fears of the Nazi stormtroops SA as a possible rival to itself. This difference on the part of the army was compensated by the support of the industrialists, who financed the Nazis from Hitler's exit from prison in 1924 to the end of 1932. The destruction of the Weimar Republic has 5 stages. Brüning, March 27th, 1930 to May 30th, 1932. Von Papen, May 31st, 1932 to November 17th, 1932. Schleicher, December 2nd, 1932 to January 28th, 1933. Hitler, January 30th, 1933 to March 5th, 1933. Gleichschaltung, March 6th, 1933 to August 2nd, 1934. All right. When the economic crisis began in 1929, Germany had a democratic government of the center and social democratic parties. The crisis resulted as a decrease in tax receipts and a parallel increase in demand for government welfare services. This brought to head the latent dispute over orthodox and unorthodox financing of a depression. Big business and big finance were determined to place the burden of the depression on the working classes by forcing the government to adopt a policy of deflation, that is, by wage reductions and curtailment of government expenditures. The Social Democrats wavered in their attitude, but in general were opposed to this policy. Schlach, as president of the Reichsbank, was able to force the socialist Rudolf Hilferding out of position of Minister of Finance by refusing bank credit to the government until this was done. In March 1930, the center broke the coalition on the issue of reduction of unemployment benefits. The socialists were thrown out of government, and Heinrich Brüning, the leader of the Center Party, came in as chancellor. Because he did not have a majority in the Reichstag, he had to put the deflationary policy into effect by the use of presidential decree under Article 48. This marked the end of the Weimar Republic, for it had never been intended that this emergency clause should be used in the ordinary process of government, although it had been used by Ebert in 1923 to abolish the 8-hour day. When the Reichstag condemned Brüning's method by a vote of 236 to 221 on July 18, 1930, the Chancellor dissolved it and called for new elections. The result of these were contrary to his hopes, since he lost seats both to the right and to the left. On his right were 148 seats, 107 Nazis and 41 nationalists. On his left were 220 seats, 77 communists and 143 socialists. The socialists permitted Brüning to stay in office by refusing to vote on a motion of no confidence. Left in office, Brüning continued the deflationary policy by decrees which Hindenburg signed. Thus, in effect, Hindenburg was the ruler of Germany, since he could dismiss or name any chancellor, or could permit one to govern by his own power of decree. Brüning's policy of deflation was a disaster. The suffering of the people was terrible, with almost 8 million unemployed out of 25 million employable. To compensate for this unpopular domestic policy, Brüning adopted a more aggressive foreign policy on such questions as reparations, union with Austria, or the World Disarmament Conference. In the crisis of 1929 to 1933, the bourgeois parties tended to dissolve to the profit of the extreme left and the extreme right. In this, the Nazi Party profited more than the Communists for several reasons. 1. It had the financial support of the industrialists and landlords. 2. It was not internationalist but nationalist, as any German party had to be. 3. It had never compromised itself by accepting the Republic even temporarily. an advantage when most Germans tended to blame the Republic for their troubles. 4. It was prepared to use violence, while the parties of the left, even the communists, were legalistic and relatively peaceful because the police and judges were of the right. The reasons why the Nazis, rather than the nationalists, profited by the turn from moderation could be explained by the fact that 1. The nationalists had compromised themselves and vacillated on every issue from 1924 to 1929, and 2. The Nazis had an advantage in that they were not clearly a party of the right, but were ambiguous. In fact, a large group of Germans considered the Nazis a revolutionary left party, differing from the communists only in being patriotic. Well, yeah, I mean, they're socialists. But it's really a mixed economy because they're working with the industrialists and the socialists. In this polarization of the political spectrum, it was the middle classes which became unanchored, driven by desperation and panic. The Social Democrats were sufficiently fortified by trade unionism, and the Center Party members were sufficiently fortified by religion to resist the drift to extremism. Unfortunately, both these relatively stable groups unfortunately, both of these relatively stable groups lacked intelligent leadership and were too wedded to old ideas and narrow interest to find any appeal broad enough for a wide range of German voters. The whole of 1932 was filled with a series of intrigues and distrustful, shifting alliances among the various groups which sought to get into a position to use the presidential power of decree. On October 11, 1931, a great reactionary alliance was made of the Nazis, the Nationalists, the Stahlhelm, a militaristic veterans organization, and the Junker Landbund. This so-called Harzburg Front pretended to be a unified opposition to communism, but really represented a part of the intrigue of these various groups to come to power. Of the real rulers of Germany, only the Westphalian industrialists and the army were absent. The industrialists were taken into camp by Hitler during a 3-hour speech which he made at the Industrial Club of Dusseldorf at the invitation of Fritz Thyssen, January 27, 1932. The army could not be brought into line since it was controlled by the presidential coterie, especially Schleicher and Hindenburg himself. Schleicher had political ambitions of his own, and the army traditionally would not commit itself in any open or formal fashion. In the middle of this crisis came the presidential election of March to April 1932. It offered a fantastic sight of a nominally democratic republic forced to choose its president from among 4 anti-democratic, anti-republican figures, of which one, Hitler, had become a German citizen only a month previously by a legal trick. Since Hindenburg appeared as the least possible of the 4, he was re-elected on the second ballot. So then there's a chart on page 432 showing the election results of that 1932 election. Hindenburg continued to support Brüning until the end of May 1932, when he dismissed him and put in von Papen. This was done at the instigation of von Schleicher, who was hoping to build up some kind of broad front coalition of nationalists and workers as a facade for the Reichswehr. In this plan, Schleicher was able to get Hindenburg to abandon Brüning by persuading him that the Chancellor was planning to break up some of the bankrupt large estates east of the Elbe and might even investigate the Hautschiffe scandals. Schleicher put in Papen as chancellor in the belief that Papen had so little support in the country that he would be completely dependent on Schleicher's ability to control Hindenburg. Instead, the president became so fond of Papen that the new chancellor was able to use Hindenburg's power directly and even began to undermine the influence of Schleicher in the president's entourage. Papen's cabinet of barons was openly a government of the Quartet and had almost no support in the Reichstag and little support in the country. Papen and Schleicher realized that it could not last long. Each began to form a plot to consolidate himself and stop the polarization of political opinion in Germany. Papen's plot was to cut off the financial contributions from industry to Hitler and break down the Nazi Party's independence by a series of expensive elections. The Chancellor felt sure that Hitler would be willing to come into a cabinet of which Papen was head in order to recover the financial contributions from industry and prevent the disruption of his party. Schleicher, on the other hand, hoped to unite the left wing of the Nazi Party under Otto Strasser with the Christian and socialist labor unions to support the Reichswehr in a program of nationalism and unorthodox finance. Both plots depended on retaining the favor of Hindenburg in order to retain control of the army and of the presidential power to issue decrees. In this, Papen was more successful than Schleicher, for the aged president had no liking for any unorthodox economic schemes. Papen's plot developed more rapidly than Schleicher's and appeared more hopeful because his greater ability to control the president. Having persuaded his close friends, the industrialists, to stop their contributions to the Nazis, Papen called a new election for November 1932. In the balloting, the Nazis were reduced from 230 to 196 seats, while the Communists were increased from 89 to 100. The tide had turned. Well, that's like the shortest sentence in this whole book. I'm pretty sure this is the shortest sentence so far. The tide has turned. This had three results. Hitler to join a coalition government, which he had previously refused. 2. The Quartet decided to overthrow the Republic in order to stop the swing to the Communists. And 3. The Quartet, especially the industrialists, decided that Hitler had learned a lesson and could safely be put into office as the figurehead of a right government because he was growing weaker. The whole deal was arranged by Papen, himself a colonel and an industrialist, as well as a Westphalian aristocrat, and was sealed in an agreement made at the home of the Cologne banker Baron Kurt von Schroeder on January 4th, 1933. This agreement came into effect because of Papen's ability to manage Hindenburg. On January 28, 1933, the president forced the resignation of Schleicher by refusing to grant him decree powers. 2 days later, Hitler came to office as chancellor in a cabinet which contained only two other Nazis. These were Minister of Air Göring and Frick in the vital Ministry of the Interior. Of the other 8 posts, 2, the ministries of Economics and Agriculture, went to Hugenberg. The Ministry of Labor went to Franz Stelte of Stahlhelm. The Foreign Ministry and the Reichswehr Ministry went to non-party experts, and most of the remaining posts went to friends of Papen. It would not seem possible for Hitler, thus surrounded, to ever obtain control of Germany, yet within a year and a half he was dictator of the country. It's going to be a long section, I can tell you. Alright. The Nazi regime coming to power 1933 to 1934. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of the German Reich on January 30th, 1933, he was not yet 44 years old. Why is that important? Why is 44 important? I don't know. From his birth in Austria in 1889, the outbreak of war in 1914, his life had been a succession of failures, the 7 years 1907 to 1914 being passed as a social derelict in Vienna and Munich. There he had become a fanatical, pan-German anti-Semite, attributing his own failures to the intrigues of international Jewry. The outbreak of the war in August 1914 gave Hitler the first real motivation of his life. He became a super patriot, joined the 16th Volunteer Bavarian Infantry, and served at the front for 4 years. In his way, he was an excellent soldier. Attached to the regimental staff as a manager for the 1st Company, he was completely happy, always volunteering for the most dangerous tasks. Although his relations with his superiors were excellent, and he was decorated with the Iron Cross, 2nd Class, in 1914, and with the Iron Cross, 1st Class, in 1918, he was never promoted beyond Private 1st Class because he was incapable of having any real relationships with his fellow soldiers or of taking command of any group of them. He remained on active service at the front for 4 years. During that period, his regiment of 3,500 suffered 3,260 killed in action, and Hitler himself was wounded twice. There were only 2 occasions on which he left the front. In October 1918, he was blinded by mustard gas and sent to a hospital at Pasewalk near Berlin. When he emerged a month later, he found the war was finished, Germany beaten, and the monarchy overthrown. He refused to become reconciled to this situation, unable to accept either defeat or the Republic. Remembering the war as the second great love of his life, the first being his mother, he stayed with the army and eventually became a political spy for the Reichswehr stationed near Munich. In the course of spying on the numerous political groups in Munich, Hitler became fascinated by the rantings of Gottfried Feder against the interest slavery of the Jews. At some meetings, Hitler himself became a participant, attacking the Jewish plot to dominate the world or ranting about the need for pan-German unity. As a result, he was asked to join the German Workers' Party and did so, becoming one of about 60 regular members and the 7th member of its executive committee. The German Workers' Party had been founded by a Munich locksmith, Anton Drexler, on January 5, 1919, as a nationalist, pan-German workers' group. In a few months, Captain Ernst Röhm of Franz von Epp's Corps of the Black Reichswehr joined the movement and became the conduit by which secret Reichswehr funds coming through EP were conveyed to the party. He also began to organize a strong-arm militia within the group, the Storm Troops, or SA. When Hitler joined in September 1919, he was put in charge of party publicity. Since this was the chief expense, and since Hitler also became the party's leading orator, public opinion soon came to regard the whole movement as Hitler's, and Rome paid the Reichswehr funds to Hitler directly. During 1920, the party grew from 54 to 3,000 members. It changed its name to National Socialist German Workers' Party, purchased the Volkslicher Beobachter with 60,000 marks of General von Epp's money, and drew up its 25-point program. The party program of 1920 was printed in the party literature for 25 years, but its provisions became more remote from attainment as years passed. Even in 1920, many of its clauses were put in to win support from the lower classes rather than because they were sincerely desired by party leaders. These included pan-Germanism, German international equality, including the abrogation of the Treaty of Versailles. 3. Living space for Germans, including colonial areas. 4. German citizenship to be based on blood only, with no naturalization, no immigration for non-Germans, and all Jews or other aliens eliminated. 5. All unearned incomes to be abolished, the state to control all monopolies, to impose an excess profits tax on corporations, to communalize the large department stores, to encourage small businesses in the allotment of government contracts, to take agricultural land for public purposes without compensation, and to provide old age pensions. 6. To punish all war profiteers and usurers with death, and 7. To see that the press, education, culture, and religion conform to the morals and religious sense of the German race. Okay. As the party grew, adding members and spreading out to link up with similar movements in other parts of Germany, Hitler strengthened his control of the group. He could do this because he had control of the party newspaper and of the chief source of money, and was its chief public figure. In July 1921, he had the party constitution changed to give the president absolute power. He was elected president. Drexler was made honorary president. I'm not laughing at the Holocaust, but it's just like, it's so obvious that you're going to vote to give the president absolute power and then make yourself the president. It's just pretty obvious. Drexler was the honorary president, while Max Eman, Hitler's sergeant in the war, was made business manager. As a consequence of this event, the SA was reorganized under Rome. The word socialism in the party name was interpreted to mean nationalism, or a society without class conflicts, and equality in the party and state was replaced by the leadership principle and the doctrine of the elite. In the next 2 years, the party passed through a series of crises, of which the chief was the attempted putsch of November 9th, 1923. During this period, all kinds of violence and illegality, even murder, were condoned by the Bavarian and Munich authorities. As a result of the failures of this period, especially the abortive putsch, Hitler became convinced that he must come to power by legal methods rather than by force. He broke with Ludendorff and ceased to be supported by the Reichswehr. He began to receive his chief financial support from the industrialists. He made a tacit alliance with the Bavarian People's Party, by which Prime Minister Heinrich Held of Bavaria raised the ban on the Nazi Party in return for Hitler's repudiation of Ludendorff's anti-Christian teaching. And Hitler formed a new armed militia, the SS, to protect himself against Rome's control of the old armed militia, the SA. In the period 1924 to 1930, the party continued without any real growth, as a lunatic fringe subsidized by the industrialists. Among the chief contributors to the party in this period were Karl Bechstein, Berlin piano manufacturer, August Borsig, a Berlin locomotive manufacturer, Emil Kirdorf, general manager of the Rhine-Westphalian Coal Syndicate, Fritz Thyssen, owner of the United Steelworks and president of the German Industrial Council, and Albert Vogler, general manager of the Gelsenkirchen Iron and Steel Company and formerly general manager of United Steelworks. During this period, neither Hitler nor his supporters were seeking to create a mass movement. That did not come until 1930, but during this earlier period, the party itself was steadily centralized, and the leftist elements, like the Strasser brothers, were weakened or eliminated. In April 1927, Hitler spoke to 400 industrialists in Essen. In April 1928, he addressed a similar group of landlords from the east of the Elbe. In January 1932 came one of his greatest triumphs when he spoke for 3 hours to the Industrial Club of Dusseldorf and won support and financial contributions from that powerful group. By that date, he was seeking to build his movement into a mass political party capable of sweeping him into office. This project failed. As we have indicated, by the end of 1932, much of the financial support from industry had been cut off by Papen, and the party membership was falling away, chiefly to the communists. To stop this decline, Hitler agreed to become chancellor in a cabinet in which there would be only 3 Nazis among 11 members. Papen hoped in this way to control the Nazis and to obtain them from the popular support which Papen had so sorely lacked in his own chancellorship in 1932. But Papen was far too clever for his own good. He, Hugenberg, Hindenburg, and the rest of the intriguers had underestimated Hitler. The latter, in return for Hugenberg's acceptance of new elections on March 5, 1933, promised that there would be no cabinet changes whatever the outcome of the voting. In spite of the fact that the Nazis obtained only 44% of the ballots in the new election, Hitler became dictator of Germany within 18 months. One of the chief reasons for this success rests on the position of Prussia within Germany. Prussia was the greatest of the 14 states of Germany, covering almost 2/3 of the country. It included both the great rural areas of the east and the great industrial areas of the west. Thus, it included the most conservative as well as the most progressive portions of Germany. While its influence was almost as great under the Republic as it had been under the Empire, this influence was of quite a different character, having changed from the chief bulwark of conservatism in the earlier period to the chief area of progressivism in the later period. This change was made possible by the large numbers of enlightened groups in the Reich Rhenish areas of Prussia, but chiefly by the fact that the so-called Weimar coalition of Social Democrats, Center Party, and Liberal Democrats remained unbroken in Prussia from 1918 to 1932. As a consequence of this alliance, a Social Democrat, Otto Braun, held the position of Prime Minister of Prussia for almost the whole period 1920 to 1932, and Prussia was the chief obstacle in the path of the Nazis and of reaction in the critical days after 1930. As a part of this movement, the Prussian cabinet in 1930 refused to allow either communists or Nazis to hold municipal offices in Prussia, prohibited Prussian civil servants from holding membership in either of these two parties, and forbade the use of the Nazi uniform. This obstacle to extremism was removed on July 20th, 1932, when Hindenburg, by presidential decree based on Article 48, appointed Papen commissioner for Prussia. Papen at once dismissed the 8 members of the Prussian parliamentary cabinet and granted their governmental functions to men named by himself. The dismissed ministers were removed from their offices by the power of the army, but at once challenged the legality of this action before the German Supreme Court at Leipzig. By its verdict of October 25, 1932, the court decided for the removed officials. In spite of this decision, Hitler, after only a week in chancellorship, was able to obtain from Hindenburg a new decree which removed the Prussian ministers from office once more and conferred their powers on the federal vice-chancellor Papen. Control of the police administration was conferred on Hermann Göring. The Nazis already held, through Wilhelm Frick, control of the Reich Ministry of Interior and thus of the national police powers. Thus, Hitler, by February 7th, had control of the police powers both of the Reich and of Prussia. Using this advantage, the Nazis began a twofold assault on the opposition. Göring and Frick worked under the cloak of legality from above, while Captain Röhm, in command of the Nazi Party stormtroops, worked without pretense of legality from below. All uncooperative police officials were retired, removed, or given vacations, and were replaced by Nazi substitutes, usually stormtroop leaders. On February 4th, 1933, Hindenburg signed an emergency decree which gave the government the right to prohibit or control any meetings, uniforms, or newspapers. In this way, most opposition meetings and newspapers were prevented from reaching the public. This attack on the opposition from above was accompanied by a violent assault from below, carried out by the stormtroopers. In desperate attacks in which 18 Nazis and 51 opposition were killed, all communist, most socialist, and many center party meetings were disrupted. In spite of all this, it was evident a week before the election that the German people were not convinced. Accordingly, under circumstances which are still mysterious, a plot was worked out to burn the Reichstag building and blame the communists. Most of the plotters were homosexual and were able to persuade a degenerate moron from Holland named Van der Lubbe to go with them. Interesting. I mean, I heard about this false flag thing, but I never heard that most of the plotters were homosexual. That was a detail I never heard before. After the building was set on fire, Van der Lubbe was left wandering about in it and was arrested. by the police. Well, yeah, of course. Who else was he arrested by? The government at once arrested 4 communists, including the party leader in the Reichstag, Ernst Torgler. The day following the fire, February 28, 1933, Hindenburg signed a decree suspending all civil liberties and giving the government power to invade any personal privacy, including the right to search private homes or confiscate property. At once, all communist members of the Reichstag, as well as thousands of others, were arrested, and all communist and social democrat papers were suspended for 2 weeks. The true story of the Reichstag fire was kept secret only with difficulty. Several persons who knew the truth, including a nationalist Reichstag member, Dr. Oberfohren, were murdered in March and April to prevent their circulating the true story. Most of the Nazis who were in on the plot were murdered by Goering during the blood purge of June 30th, 1934. The 4 communists who were directly charged with the crime were acquitted by regular German courts, although van der Lubbe was convicted. In spite of these drastic measures, the election of March 5, 1933 was a failure from the Nazi point of view. Hitler's party received only 288 of 647 seats, or 43.9% of the total vote. The Nationalist obtained only 8%. The Communist obtained 81 seats, a decrease of 19, but the Socialist obtained 125, an increase of 4. The Center Party fell from 80 to 74, and the People's Party from 11 to 2. The Nationalists stayed at 52 seats. In the simultaneous election of the Prussian Diet, the Nazis obtained 211 and the Nationalists 43 out of 474 seats. The period from the election of March 5, 1933 to the death of Hindenburg on August 2, 1934 is generally called the period of coordination, Gleichschaltung. The process was carried on like the electoral campaign just finished by illegal actions from below and legalistic actions from above. From below, on March 7th, throughout Germany, the stormtroopers swept away much of the opposition by violence, driving it into hiding. They marched to most offices of trade unions, periodicals, and local governments, smashing them up, expelling their occupants, and raising the swastika flag. Minister of the Interior Wilhelm Frick condoned these actions by naming Nazis as police presidents in various German states: Baden, Saxony, Württemberg, Bavaria, including the General von Epp in Bavaria. These men then proceeded to use their police powers to seize control of the apparatus of state government. The new Reichstag met on March 23rd at the Kroll Opera House. In order to secure a majority, the Nazis excluded from the session all of the communist and 30 socialist members, about 109 in all. The rest were asked to pass an enabling act which would give the government for 4 years the right to legislate by decree without the need for presidential signature, as in Article 48, and without constitutional restrictions except in respect to the powers of the Reichstag, the Reichsrat, and the presidency. Let's see if any chapter breaks. Not really. Since this law requiring a two-thirds majority, it could have been beaten if only a small group of the Center Party had voted against it. To be sure, Hitler made it very clear that he was prepared to use violence against all who refused to cooperate with him, but his power to do so on a clear-cut constitutional issue in March 1933 was much less than it became later, since violence from him on such a question might well have arrayed the president and the Reichswehr against him. In spite of Hitler's intimidating speech, Otto Wels of the Social Democrats rose to explain why his party refused to support the bill. He was followed by Monsignor Cass of the Center Party, who explained that his Catholic group would support it. The vote in favor of the bill was more than sufficient, being 441 to 94, with the Social Democrats forming the solid minority. Thus, this weak, timid, doctrinary, and ignorant group redeemed themselves by their courage after the 11th hour had passed. Under this enabling act, the government issued a series of revolutionary decrees in the next few months. The diets of all the German states except Prussia, which had its own election on March 5th, were reconstituted in the proportions of votes in the national election of March 5th, except that the communists were thrown out. Each party was given its quota of members and allowed to name the individual members on a purely party basis. A similar procedure was applied to local governments. Thus, the Nazis A similar procedure was applied to local governments. Thus, the Nazis received a majority in each body. A decree of April 7th gave the Reich government the right to name a governor of each German state. This was a new official empowered to enforce the policies of the Reich government, even to the point of dismissing the state governments, including the prime ministers, diets, and the hitherto irremovable judges. This right was used in each state to make a Nazi governor and a Nazi prime minister. In Bavaria, for example, the two were Epp and Röhm, while in Prussia the two were Hitler and Göring. In many states, the governor was the district leader of the Nazi Party, and where he was not, he was subject to that leader's orders. By a later law of January 30th, 1934, the diets of the states were abolished, the sovereign powers of the states were transferred to the Reich, and the governors were made subordinates of the Reich Ministry of the Interior. All of the political parties except the Nazis were abolished in May, June, and July of 1933. The Communists had been outlawed on February 28th. The Social Democrats were enjoined from all activities on June 22nd and were expelled from various governing bodies on July 7th. The German State Party, Democratic Party, and the German People's Party were dissolved on June 28th and July 4th. The Bavarian People's Party was smashed by the stormtroopers on July 22nd and disbanded itself on July 4th. The Center Party did the same thing on the following day. A series of pitched battles between the stormtroopers and the Stahlhelm in April to June 1933 ended with the absorption of the latter into the Nazi Party. The Nationalists were smashed by violence on June 21st. Hugenberg was unable to penetrate the stormtroopers' guard around Hindenburg to protest, and on June 28th, his party was dissolved. Finally, on July 14, 1933, the Nazi Party was declared to be the only recognized party in Germany. The middle classes were coordinated and disappointed. Wholesale and retail trade associations were consolidated into a Reich Corporation of German Trade under the Nazi Dr. von Rentelen. On July 22nd, the same man became president of the German Industrial and Trade Committee, which was a union of all the chambers of commerce. In Germany, these last had been semi-public legal corporations. The breakup of the great department stores, which had been one of the Nazi promises to the petty bourgeois since Gottfried Feder's 25-point program of 1920, was abandoned, according to Hess's announcement of July 7th. Moreover, liquidation of the cooperative society, which had also been a promise of long duration, was abandoned by an announcement of July 19th. This last reversal resulted from the fact that most of the cooperatives had come under Nazi control by being taken over by the Labor Front on March 16, 1933. Labor was coordinated without resistance except from the communists. The government declared May 1st a national holiday and celebrated it with a speech by Hitler on the dignity of labor before 1 million persons at Tempelhof. The next day, the stormtroopers seized all Union buildings and offices, arrested all Union leaders, and sent most of these to concentration camps. The unions themselves were incorporated into a Nazi German labor front under Robert Ley. The new leader, in an article in the Volkscher Beobachter, promised employers that henceforth they could be masters in their own houses as long as they served the nation, that is, the Nazi Party. Work was supplied for labor by reducing the work week to 40 hours with a corresponding wage cut, by prohibiting aliens to work, by enforcing labor service for the government, by grants of loans to married persons, by tax cuts for persons who spent money on repair, by construction of military automobile roads, and so forth. All right. Agriculture was coordinated only after Hugenberg left the government on June 29th and was replaced by Richard Darr as Reich Minister of Food and Prussian Minister of Agriculture. The various land and peasant associations were merged into a single association of which Darr was president, while the various landlords' associations were united into the German Board of Agriculture, of which Darr was president also. Religion was coordinated in various ways. The evangelical church was reorganized when a non-Nazi, Friedrich von Bodelschwingh, was elected Reich Bishop in May 1933. He was forcibly removed from office, and the National Synod was forced to elect a Nazi, Ludwig Müller, in his place, September 27th. At the elections for church assemblies in July 1933, government pressure was so great that a majority of Nazis was chosen in each. The pressure was so great that a majority of Nazis were chosen in each. Like, that's how they wrote it. It says a majority of Nazis was chosen. It should be a majority of Nazis were chosen. In 1935, A Ministry of Church Affairs under Hans Kerrl was set up with power to issue church ordinances having the force of law and with complete control over church property and funds. Prominent Protestant leaders like Martin Niemöller, who objected to these steps, were arrested and sent to concentration camps. See, it wasn't just Jewish people that were getting sent to the concentration camps. The Catholic Church made every effort to cooperate with the Nazis, but soon found it was impossible. It withdrew its condemnation of Nazism on March 28, 1933, and signed a concordat with von Papen on July 20th. By this agreement, the state recognized freedom of religious belief and of worship, exemption of the clergy from certain civic duties, and the right of the church to manage its own affairs and to establish denominational schools. Governors of the German states were given a right to object to nominations to the highest clerical posts. Bishops were to take an oath of loyalty, and education was to continue to function as it had been doing. This agreement with the church began to break down almost at once. Within 10 days of signing the Concordat, the Nazis began to attack the Catholic Youth League and the Catholic press. Church schools were restricted, and members of the clergy were arrested and tried on charges of evading the monetary foreign exchange regulations and of immorality. The church condemned the efforts of the Nazis like Rosenberg to replace Christianity by a revived German paganism and such laws as that permitting sterilization of socially objectionable persons. Rosenberg's book, The Myth of the 20th Century, was put on the index. Catholic scholars exposed its errors in a series of studies in 1934, and finally, on March 14, 1932, Pope Pius XI condemned many of the tenets of Nazism in the encyclical Mit brennender Sorge. I don't know what that means. Attempts to coordinate the civil service began with the law of April 7, 1933, and continued to the end of the regime without ever being completely successful because of the lack of capable personnel who were loyal Nazis. Non-Aryans, Jews, or persons married to non-Aryans, politically unreliable persons, and Marxists were discharged, and loyalty to Nazism was required for appointment and promotion in the civil service. Of the chief elements in German society, only the presidency, the army, the Catholic Church, and industry were not coordinated by 1934. In addition, the bureaucracy was only partially controlled. The first of these, the presidency, was taken over completely in 1934 as the result of a deal with the army. By the spring of 1934, the problem of the stormtroopers had become acute, since this organization was directly challenging two members of the quartet, the army and the industry. Industry was being challenged by the demand of the stormtroopers for the Second Revolution, that is, for the economic reforms which would justify the use of the word socialism in the name National Socialism. The army was being challenged by the demand of Captain Rome that his stormtroopers be incorporated into the Reichswehr, with each officer holding the same rank in the latter as he already held in the former. Since the Reichswehr had only 300,000 men, while the stormtroopers had 3 million, this would have swamped the officers' corps. Hitler had denounced this project on July 1, 1933, and Frick repeated this 10 days later. Nevertheless, Rome repeated his demands on April 18, 1934, and was echoed by Edmund Heinz and Karl Ernst. In full cabinet meeting, Minister of War General von Blumberg refused. The tense situation developed. If Hindenburg died, the Reichswehr might have liquidated the Nazis and restored the monarchy. On June 21st, Hindenburg ordered Blumberg to use the army, if necessary, to restore order in the country. This was regarded as a threat to the stormtroopers. Accordingly, Hitler made a deal to destroy the stormtroopers in return for a free hand to deal with the presidency when it became vacant. This was done. A meeting of stormtrooper leaders was called by Hitler for June 31st, 1934, at Bad Weiss in Bavaria. The SS, under Hitler's personal command, arrested the SA leaders in the middle of the night and shot most of them at once. In Berlin, Goering did the same thing, the SA leaders there. Both Hitler and Goering almost killed most of their also killed most of their personal enemies. The Reichstag incendiaries, Gregor Strasser, General and Miss von Schleicher, all of Von Pappen's close associates, Gustav von Kahr, all of those who had known Hitler in the early days of his failure, and many others. Papen escaped only by a narrow margin. In all, several thousand were eliminated in this blood purge. Two excuses were given for this violent action: that the murdered men were homosexuals, something which had been known for years, and that they were members of a conspiracy to murder Hitler. That they were in a conspiracy was quite true, but it was by no means mature in 1934, and it was aimed at the army and heavy industry and not at Hitler. In fact, Hitler had been wavering until the last moment whether he would throw in his lot with the Second Revolution or with the Quartet. His decision to join the latter and exterminate the former was an event of great significance. It irrevocably made the Nazi movement a counter-revolution of the right, using the party organization as an instrument for protecting the economic status quo. The supporters of the Second Revolution were driven underground, forming a Black Front under the leadership of Otto Strasser. This movement was so ineffectual that the only choice facing the average German was the choice between the reactionary mode of life built about the surviving members of the Quartet, army and industry, and the completely irrational nihilism of the inner clique of the Nazi Party. Only as the regime approached its end did the third possible way appear: a revived, progressive, and cooperative Christian humanism which sprang from the reaction engendered within the Quartet by the realization that Nazi nihilism was merely the logical outcome of the Quartet's customary methods of pursuing its customary goals. Many of the persons associated with this new third way were destroyed by the Nazis in the systematic destructiveness which followed the attempt to assassinate Hitler on June 2, 1944. In return for Hitler's decisive step, the destruction of the stormtroopers on June 30, 1934, the army permitted Hitler to become president following Hindenburg's death in August. By combining the offices of the president and chancellor, Hitler obtained the presidential legal right to rule by decree and obtained as well the supreme command of the army, a position which he solidified by requiring a personal oath of unconditional obedience from each soldier. Law of August 20th, 1934. From this time on, in the minds of the Reichswehr and the bureaucracy, it was both legally and morally impossible to resist Hitler's orders. All right, so that's the end of that section. I'm on page 443. The next section is the rulers and the ruled, 1934 to 1945. So we can see that it's kind of funny because it was kind of similar to the Trump thing in the sense that the opposition party wanted to put Hitler in office because they thought that he was weak and controllable, which was kind of similar. That's why Hillary Clinton liked that Trump was running, because she thought that no one would vote for him, right? But then that was a mistake, kind of similar to what happened with Hitler. So he was able to gain power. And then you see what happened after that. Okay, so this video has been going on pretty long today. Don't forget to check out David Icke, iconic.com, his new book. And I will be back with another video at some point. So thanks for watching. If you did, have a good day and peace.